Dave, we'll pick it up from here. So, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome online and here in the room, and thank you for joining us for the December meeting. And for this nice fallish day outside, and here in Arlington. So I'll just go ahead and get it started here. And I'd like to introduce our speaker, Joseph Trujillo Falcón. He is a PhD student at OU. He is conducting bilingual disaster communication research in partnership with the university, with CIWRO, with the Storm Prediction Center, and with NSSL. He has a bachelor's in meteorology and in Spanish from Texas A&M, a master's in communications at OU. He's well known in the community. He is chair of the AMS Committee of Hispanic and Latinx Advancement. He was awarded the AMS Early Career Professional Achievement Award in 2022, and I've seen some of his research. I've talked to him before. He's a great person. This will be a fun and fascinating presentation. So with that, Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much, everyone, for the wonderful opportunity to present today. I'm super duper excited to show you everything within the realm of bilingual risk communication. It's a field that I'm very passionate about. Actually, as a matter of fact, this presentation means so much to me, just because not only of the fact that I can present to such a wonderful group, but actually the North Texas local AMS chapter was the very first chapter I ever got affiliated with back when I was in high school. I was raised in the Irving, Texas area, and so it's been a wonderful 360 moment to be able to come back and reconnect. I'm super excited. My first internship was actually in Telemundo, Dallas. There in the DFW area. And as a aspiring broadcast meteorologist, I always wanted to engage with communities, and especially bilingual groups that are particularly vulnerable in disaster contexts. And so with that, today I wanted to showcase some of the work we've been doing in that space so that we can better reach these communities going forward. So really, a lot of this work ends up culminating into not just research stemming from actual survey data that we have done with several folks, but we've also been able to garner insights from the field, actually going into places in the aftermath of a tornado event to actually speak to them. And so super excited to talk with you today. I wanted to start off today's presentation with a story that just happened 10 years ago, right down the street here in Oklahoma City. Of course, the May 31st, 2013 tornado event goes down in history as being a significant tornado event affecting many communities. And well, during this time frame, there was a big tornado approaching the Oklahoma City metro region. Sirens were going off, and people were really starting to take notice of the incoming hazard. That's only if you spoke English, of course, because during that time, the only information being disseminated out to those communities were in English. If you did not know that language, you did not have access to life-saving information. It was the fate of a Guatemalan family, a Spanish-speaking family of 7, that heard these alerts go off, that heard the sirens, but couldn't understand what it really meant. And that really got them to take action, but unfortunately the wrong action. They went to go seek shelter underneath a storm drain. And though the tornado never got there, there was also a flash flood threat present. But because they couldn't understand alerts in their dominant language, they did not were able to at least be able to conceptualize the fact that they cannot be underneath the storm drain during this event. This was 7 of the 9 Spanish speakers that were taken from us on this day, and I'd like to introduce to you La Familia Cifuentes y Sarat Santos. This happened 10 years ago here down the street in Oklahoma City, and it was a stark reminder of the consequences of having a monolingual emergency system. In an event where hazards are becoming more extreme and definitely more imminent and sometimes a lot more uncertain, we have to be cognizant of multilingual populations across the nation. I always like to highlight this on a more broader scale just by showing you the perspective of it all, because as of right now, there's 41 million Spanish speakers, and by 2060, that number is expected to nearly triple to 119 million, where nearly 1 in 4 people will speak Spanish. So it's really not a matter of if, but when this becomes more consequential in our emergency system. And so that's honestly something we really wanted to delve into today. Some of the barriers to bilingual disaster communication and some of the work that and some of the social science research that our team has conducted over the last couple of years. To start things off, I wanted to delve in a little bit into the realm of language inequities, where we go and show an example of a storm prediction center risk category and how we were able to translate that into Spanish and how that may look like in across different regions in Latin America as well. And then follow up with the research study that we did in the field, where we actually got to talk to multilingual communities in the aftermath of a tornado event to really get a sense as to how they responded to disaster. So to start things
Joseph,
off, oh, sorry.
uh, can you swap displays, please? We're seeing the notes slide.
Oh, oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries. We just wanted to make sure it was easier to see here in the room. That's all.
Yeah, let's see if I can do that. Let's see. Are you able to see my screen now?
We're
Or is
still
it
on the
still
notes slide, but there's a swap displays button up top.
perfect? Is that good?
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank y'all so much. Sorry about that. But what a great segue into this, just because when we are discussing multilingual risk communication, and especially translation, a lot of the things can get lost in translation and because of dialects of the regional variety of a given language. And to explain that, I actually want to show you an example of just a common interaction between two individuals. Because in English, for example, the word friend is usually one word, one singular word, and really doesn't have any varieties. But in Spanish, depending on where you're from or how you're raised, you say the word friend in different ways. I promise this makes sense in a second. Just give me a chance here. Because in Mexico, the way you say friend is compa, where in Spain, you say tío. Costa Rica, you say mae, or where I'm from in Peru, we say causa or pata. These are dialects, the regional varieties of a given language. Depending on where you're from or how you're raised, you speak a different quote unquote version of Spanish. Now, that's not for the majority of words, but some words do have that variety, and it's beautiful. It expresses our culture, it expresses where we're from. But whenever we're trying to communicate across groups, it can get a little bit confusing. Like, for example, Spain, tío is uncle in many parts of Latin America. I remember the first time a Spaniard came up to me and said, Hola, tío. I was like, what? I'm not your uncle, but one of many examples of that. But when we apply this to a storm context, we could really see how this can become a little bit confusing because one word in English can mean other things to a different multilingual speakers depending on where they're from or how they're raised. And so, for example, the word thunderstorm has 4 different ways of being translated into Spanish. Tormenta, tronada, borrasca, temporal. Here in the United States, we mainly use tormenta, but there are other folks out there that there are various ways to translate it. Another recent fun example we just learned about is the term rip current, just because initially that was translated into Spanish by the National Weather Service as a corriente de resaca. But the word resaca in many parts of Latin America also mean hangover instead of actual rip currents. And so there would be hangover warnings being issued for the coast, which I guess is technically correct, but not essentially the hazard we're trying to get people to take action against. And so one of many examples of how messages can get lost in translation. And that happened exactly with the Storm Prediction Center risk categories. I know we're all familiar with them, especially here in DFW, marginal all the way to high. And these categories were translated into Spanish as of recently, and all the way to mínimo, all the way to alto. And that was translated back in 2014, really as a big result of what happened during the 2013 event here in Oklahoma City. But we started to quickly realize that though these translations were out, broadcasters started communicating them in different ways. That captivated our interest, just because depending on which television station you were tuning into, you were actually getting completely different risk categories. For example, you could turn on the Good Morning America equivalent and get and anything in red there is anything different than the SPC risk categories. So you'd get a completely different set. In the afternoon, when you want an update on the incoming severe weather, you could tune into the same station and get a different set of risk categories. If you wanted to verify that with their competitor station, sure enough, different set of risk categories. these inconsistencies aren't just inconsistencies themselves. The fact that these words have different interpretations, different levels of risk is very, very important because it can prompt different decisions. And so we wanted to get a better sense into this. And so we conducted a nationwide survey of about 1,050 Spanish speakers to test out how the current risk categories by the Storm Prediction Center fared with a proposed change that we worked together with linguistic experts and said, okay, there's different varieties of Spanish, but there are ways to communicate it that are dialect neutral. And so we wanted to test those two alternatives out. And sure enough, we started to find why these inconsistencies started happening. A lot of the broadcasters weren't translating the original SPC risk categories because to them, it knew that it was communicating different levels of risks, and they did not want to confuse their audience because, at least from the survey data, we found that level 3 and level 5 from the original translation were communicating the same level of risk and urgency. And so, of course, a broadcaster didn't want to communicate extreme urgency for a level 3 alert. They want to save it more for the level 5. And then, of course, moderate, as is in English, often gets ranked in the middle there. But with the proposed translations that we worked together with those experts, Spanish speakers were able to correctly identify from level 1 all the way to 5 in levels of risk urgency. This was very important because it was not just applicable to the entire sample, but across all the different dialect groups where they were able to, at the top there, that's the original translations, and at the bottom are the proposed translations. And depending on where you're from or how you're raised, they were able to categorize them correctly. As in the other case, it was a lot more variable overall. And so this was a huge, huge insight into our community of how messages can get lost in translation and how we really shouldn't be translating the word of the message, but rather the meaning of it. It might not line up perfectly between English and Spanish, and that inconsistency is okay, just because as long as the meaning gets across, that's ultimately our goal at the end of the day. And as a result, we showed this to the Storm Prediction Center, and as of last year, we were able to implement it nationwide. To where now the new risk categories in Spanish are mínimo, bajo, moderado, alto, and extremo. It was a huge victory, the first ever research to operations effort in Spanish across the National Weather Service. And it was something that we were extremely, extremely proud of to be able to do, because this not only affected how we communicated within government agencies, but it also introduced the landscape across all television networks. And so depending on where you're from, if you tune in into an Univision or Telemundo station, you will most likely see them using these risk categories now. We're able to do it in a more consistent manner, and we're super excited that research was able to pave the way for something like this to happen. And so this is one example of many how our work has really expanded and really challenged the status quo in how we go about translating information, finding proper ways to do it based in social science research and recommendations made by the community for the community. In this next example here, I wanted to show you something just beyond language, just because a lot of the time I know, it's very, very hard to translate something from English to Spanish, but after that, it gets even more difficult. And, I always like to emphasize to folks that translation is always the first step when it comes to communicating risk to a multilingual speaker. You have to actually contextualize it to someone's culture, and you have to consider other variables that take into account that may hinder them from taking protective action altogether. I want to showcase some examples of this by the recent December 10th to 11th, 2021 tornado outbreak that just happened 2 years ago this last weekend, where, of course, a ton of tornadoes affected Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, parts of Illinois. It was a very, very extreme event, causing $3.9 billion of damage, and now ranked as the deadliest December tornado outbreak in American history. It definitely caught our eyes because the main area in which a lot of the destruction was seen was in Mayfield, Kentucky. And the tornado actually passed through a candle factory that housed a lot of undocumented workers there that also spoke Spanish only. I remember tuning into Good Morning America and seeing that interview of how people were praying in circles, not knowing what was going to happen to them. It was an event that we wanted to better understand, especially in an area like Mayfield, where there are no bilingual stations out there where a science communicator can get that information out to them. So we wanted to go visit these communities and understand how they process warnings all together in a monolingual emergency system. And we went to go about understanding that using a social science theory called the warning response model. It explains the cognitive process that you undergo when you first receive a warning. Because when you think about it, when your phone goes off and you receive a warning, you don't immediately run into shelter. You first have to understand the message, believe in it, whether it's accurate or maybe it's just a spam bot. It has to be personalized to you. Yeah, sure, there's a tornado warning issued for my area, but does that mean my neighborhood? Also, you will mill for information or gain additional context. Ask others. Tune into a different television station, text a friend that's really knowledgeable, and you have to undergo all those things before you end up making a decision altogether. And so using this model, we wanted to understand how Hispanic and Latino immigrants understood, believed, personalized, milled, and made decisions during this outbreak. We went to go visit communities, and let me go back a slide here. Went to go visit communities head on, and visited community centers, local faith organizations, even school districts, and talked to different folks about their experiences in the aftermath of a tornado. The majority of these folks were tornado survivors, like actually experiencing the direct effects. We did it at a reasonable time after a lot of the emergency crews were there. Of course, we didn't want to get in the way of that. So we went a couple of months after and interviewed 25 people in English and Spanish. That resulted in over 248 pages of transcripts. Not only did we interview the immigrants themselves, but also the community leaders, an effective player that I'll elaborate on in a second here. But just to give you a glimpse as to how some of the multilingual populations responded in this event, when it comes to understanding the information altogether, if the alert or message is not in your dominant language, of course, you don't have much resources to even make a decision altogether. Rosa, a Guatemalan immigrant, and by the way, all these names are anonymized for the protection of their identities, but Rosa, a Guatemalan immigrant, heard that her phone was going off over and over, but was only seeing the English wireless emergency alert. And, not knowing what it meant, she just ignored it. It was scaring her a lot. But as of recently, WIAs have actually been automated to be translated into Spanish. So the third time she actually noticed there was a Spanish component to it. If it was not for that Spanish component, she would not have prompted her family to go downstairs. When we interviewed Rosa, the second floor of her home was completely wiped out, just showing the difference between life and death of what an emergency alert can do if it's actually translated into the dominant language of an individual. Something very, very powerful to kind of show you a real life example of that. When it comes to belief or being able to trust information altogether, especially in a lot of undocumented communities, people are really worried about emergency officials. It's important to acknowledge that, for example, FEMA is under the same Department of Homeland Security as ICE is, and that has history of separating families, causing a lot less trust within those communities. And Patricia elaborated on this, that she would much rather stay home than risk going to a public shelter because there's a current myth actually being spread around that community that they might check for documentation status. Although that is really a myth, public shelters are available for everyone. It is something that it is important for us emergency personnel to know so that we can be able to tailor that information better in the future. When it comes to personalization or whether it's actually going to affect you or not, I found this particular issue to be very interesting, especially in an area like DFW and where I'm here at in Oklahoma. We're used to tornadoes all the time, but for some of these multilingual groups recently immigrating to the United States, tornadoes might not be as familiar or they might not have heard of them altogether. Even the concept of a 7-day forecast is very unfamiliar to some folks. Saul, Mexican immigrant in Mayfield, described this, that growing up, he didn't have electricity, so really didn't need to stay aware of news or even didn't know the concept of a 7-day forecast until he immigrated to the United States. And so let alone when the sirens started going off, he didn't really know what that meant and didn't know how to respond to the situation altogether. That's what we call in the social science world disaster subcultures, because your upbringings teach you how to respond to disasters. Like, for example, in Peru, where I'm from, I was raised in an area with a ton of earthquakes. So the infrastructure, the emergency alerts were all set towards that hazard. But when I moved to the United States, to Irving, Texas, here in DFW, the sky started exploding, and I was like, "Whoa! Like, what is this?" That's what disaster subcultures go to explain, and it doesn't have to be across countries. When you consider California versus Oklahoma, two very different climates, and so people from California might not know how to respond to a tornado because they might have never, although they may have heard of it in movies like Twister, they may not know how to respond to it because they don't have that experience or that culture of being prepared for it altogether. So Saul is a good example of that in this case. When it comes to seeking additional information, especially in an area where there's only monolingual emergency alerts, people have to resort to other sources. And Mateo, a Puerto Rican community leader, stated that he's a pastor at a congregation there. And suddenly he became the leading expert in this, even though he had no expertise in weather communication altogether. Everyone from his congregation that only spoke Spanish started mass texting him on WhatsApp. Hey, pastor, is there going to be a storm? Like, I'm hearing these sirens go off. What does this even mean? And suddenly, not only was he a pastor, but now he was the leading risk communicator in his community. This is so important, especially for our folks at the Weather Service and within NOAA, in really extending our partnerships, this Weather Ready Nation concept, to our various local partners, because I know a lot of the time it can be intimidating in reaching these multilingual communities, but these local community leaders actually have a lot of trust and expertise in this, and they're more than willing to help. Actually, in the aftermath, we connected Mateo to someone at the National Weather Service because he was like, I'd appreciate any resources because I have no idea. Even he learned what a tornado warning was in that moment. So something very important to conceptualize there. And when it comes to decision making, because of the language inequities that we explained, the immigration vulnerabilities, and everything else, overall, for a multilingual speaker, it takes a longer time for them to respond altogether because they have to verify information from sources that are not experts in the area. They have to try to decipher some of the messages from English and consult with other individuals. And by undergoing all of this, looking at these different sources, it prolongs their time to actually go into shelter. And in the case of a tornado, that can be the difference between life and death, just a couple of seconds. And so that was our big finding there, that in a monolingual emergency system like Mayfield, Kentucky, where there was no resources in Spanish or other languages as well, people were left to fend on their own and start consulting with local leadership and start consulting within their own communities. But that prolongs their time, and it can also introduce faulty decision making because these individuals are not experts. So as a result, we wanted to give back to this community after having them share such important perspectives to this altogether. And we worked together with a local weather service office in Paducah to help automate some of their warning messages and introduce them to some educational graphics in Spanish so that their local community are better able to understand those hazards. They've implemented this now, and most recently, they went above and beyond and created their own Spanish language National Weather Service website, which I'll share in the chat box after this presentation. It's super cool. And we also worked locally with Ryan Vaughn, a local broadcaster in Arkansas, that we were able to translate some of those alerts into Spanish so that it could just be automated to where we don't even have to lift a finger and just get that information out there in very, very dire events. And so this was one example of many, and especially with the tornadoes that just happened this last week in some of the very similar regions, it just goes to show that these events continue to happen and these vulnerabilities still exist out there. And we can reach these communities and we can engage them. It's just a matter of finding the best strategies and being able to do so. I wanted to conclude today's presentation with with just some thoughts here, because this is a very, very huge challenge. And as I mentioned before, it's only continued to increase in coverage. And it's just something very, very important in our enterprise, especially as more communities become more diverse. The very first time a language inequity was first ever reported by the National Weather, or by NOAA, traces back all the way to 1970, when a big tornado went through the Lubbock area. And about half of those deaths were actually attributed to the Spanish-speaking population. That was the first time a government report ever mentioned the fact that a language inequity existed in a tornado context and really in all weather hazard contexts. And since then, we've had considerable advances in this, where we can trace the first translation in the Weather Service all the way to the 1960s by the San Juan office in Puerto Rico. We talked with their MIC there, and we were able to find when the first translation was ever made. And since then, we've continued to advance initiatives to create things into Spanish. Within the research world, it didn't come till 1988 to have the first ever study on language inequities. Until 1991 to introduce a broadcast meteorologist that speaks Spanish here in the United States, and that was John Morales there. And so really a lot of these concepts are new in the bilingual landscape, and only recently has a weather service created nationwide teams to actually encounter this. The Spanish outreach team and the multimedia assistance in Spanish team are two nationwide teams that can help local WFOs translate information into Spanish. And you can actually work with them. If you need anything translated, you can hit them up on NWS chat, and they're very happy to work with you to translate information. They have been critical partners and people that have pushed these resources into the next level, and so grateful for their efforts, because they've been able to connect with bilingual stations, with bilingual communities nationwide. But it goes to show that, this issue has been here for decades now, really, and translation efforts have happened for decades. It's only been recently that we've been paying attention to it as they started becoming more and more serious, which is why I'm a fond believer, especially from where I come from in Lima, Peru, and moving here to the United States and actually interacting in these communities, that when we mean a weather-ready nation, that should mean for everyone. It should include everyone, no matter the language you speak or where you come from, especially in these vulnerable events. It's so important that we include everybody in this conversation. Because, just 10 years ago, the last remaining member of the Cifuentes and Sarat Santos family reflected on this, of the tragedy that happened to his family and how we can move forward. And one of his very big hopes in this landscape was that we introduce these sorts of methods going forward. He actually expressed that in an interview, that going forward, he just wishes these sorts of things become anomalies. And it is my hope that through extended collaboration with our partners within the National Weather Service and extended research in this area, where we're trying to unravel a lot of these language inequities, we can make that come true, where these events start becoming anomalies and we no longer have language inequities. But that's going to take a lot of work. And we're super invested in this effort. And here within the University of Oklahoma and the Cooperative Institute and the National Severe Storms Lab, we're tackling this issue head on with surveys, as you just saw, and field work in the aftermath of an event, so we can better understand communities. And so with that, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time. If you're ever interested in expanding multilingual services in your region, there's my email along with my contact information. Always love to start a conversation. There's a lot of wonderful resources out there that you can take advantage of, and I'm just super excited to engage in that conversation if you'd like. But again, thank y'all so much for your time, and I'm now open for any questions.
Thank you so much. This was a great presentation. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions online to those in the room here.
Yeah.
Shannon?
Yeah. So thank you for your presentation. That was fantastic. I really appreciated that. I'm curious to know, like, what's the next step? What else do you think needs to be tackled or accomplished? I know working with the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and we do a lot of translations for the public as well. And we're finding, at least in North Texas, that third emerging language is Vietnamese. And so we're having to, we're translating a lot of things, not only in Spanish, but also into Vietnamese. So is there discussions beyond, and I realize we're not gonna be able to hit them all, but I'm just curious, like, or if you're working like maybe with the local offices, there might be large populations in certain areas that maybe there needs to be a special translation for that area.
Oh, for sure. Thank you so much for that question, by the way. Yes, a lot of what we're learning right now in Spanish can really be applied into other languages as well. Just the language inequities and the concept of mistranslations altogether can be two very important things that we can continue to tackle with this research. But something I actually wanted to show you here, and let me share my screen, is some of the efforts we've been embarking on using this social science research to apply to other languages as well. we've actually been using artificial intelligence to create some of these translations, and you can access this today if you wanted to. I invite you to. It's weather.gov/translate, to where we are currently testing. This is all experimental at this moment, but we are looking to being able to automatically translate a lot of these efforts, because the big reason of why we haven't been able to have translations is that we don't have enough staff and enough people power to really put that together. But for example, here, if we did want Vietnamese, we do have a Vietnamese option here. For right now, the only experimental office that's trying this out is New York City. But just to show you here, if we use New York City and we look at some of their recent products, for example, this is a severe thunderstorm warning. Let's see, that one didn't, that's not a good example. I guess right now, probably the AI machine is down. It is experimental in general, but let me pull up another example here. Yeah, here's one in Spanish, for example, where here's the flash flood statement in English, and the AI automatically translated it into Spanish. We're working with this AI model. We're teaching it as it goes. And so the Weather Service actually provided their domain to them so that they can understand all the weather terminology. And us in the social science team have been helping with some research in the area to find the best translations for some of these words. And so this is kind of a result of what it's learned. This has been 2 years in the making, and so far it has about a 97% accuracy rate. So it still has a few fixes to make, which is why it's experimental. But you're able to get information in other languages. And so here's the severe weather statement. And there's other things here like, let's see, for example, let me pull this up real quick just to show you where to go. There it is. Yeah, so for example, the maps of all the hazards here, there's and let me make this a little bit bigger. Probably that was a lot smaller. So there's the one in Spanish, here's the one in Vietnamese and things like that. And so we're currently testing this out, and we encourage you that if this is of particular interest to you, please visit this website. There's a survey there that kind of asks a little bit about how you would use this information. And so we're just testing this out with different products right now. And so we invite you to contribute to it and provide your perspective in it, just because we're trying to figure out the best way to go about rolling this out, but it is providing some promising results in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
I had a question. There are a lot of applications out there these days that you can sort of configure what language you want them to be in. And are any of these applications that you know of starting to get smarter to know that they need to go to these resources in this language? Or do the users generally have to kind of figure that out where they need to go to get that particular translation?
No, for sure. That's a really, really good question. Yeah, no, it really traditionally, it's just been more of a grassroots effort overall of just like, local communities being interested in introducing multilingual information. Most of the time it's been Spanish. And so the Weather Service, through their 2 translation teams have been able to provide that information for them. But we're starting to take a more innovative approach going into the future. I think this is where social science becomes so important. In conjunction with this AI project, we're building a GIS platform to where we can actually put census data on top of WFO regions, so that you can actually understand the composition of your community. Because I do believe that if we don't have a good sense of what the composition of a community in what terms of what languages you speak, we might be translating it into Spanish, but if no one speaks Spanish around, then there's no use for it. And so we are trying to introduce GIS and introduce some of the language data that they have so that we can get a better sense of, okay, this is where the Vietnamese community is located. This is where the Spanish-speaking community is located. This is where we should focus our efforts in. And hopefully in the future, through the survey data that I just showed, be able to click on an area and say, this is X% Spanish speakers. Spanish speakers tend to be really familiar with hurricanes, but not as much tornadoes. So it could possibly help someone in the Weather Service or any other practitioner out there trying to personalize that information. Because I do admit it's very hard. It's very hard. You'd have to go out and start meeting a lot of folks. And I know, time is very, very valuable. So we're trying to find ways to shorten that as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks.
Of course.
I'll come around and ask one. So you kind of mentioned earlier with recurrence or, the hangover warnings, usually localized around college campuses, I believe. How have the research been with other types of hazards and scales, like with hurricanes, with winter weather, or, with other things that, occur here in the U.S.?
No, awesome. Thank you so much for that question. That's a really good one, just because it really depends on the hazard, especially at least in the Spanish perspective, with the hazards that Spanish speakers have most familiarity with. So, for example, with hurricanes, a lot of them, at least in the coastal areas, understand that a lot and have the terminology to do so because they've been navigating those hazards for a really long time. But the one hazard that has really got our attention and really introduced a lot of challenges are winter weather hazards. Just because in a lot of parts of Latin America, being extremely tropical and being way, way more warm, being closer to the equator, they don't have to navigate winter weather as much. And so because they haven't been able to navigate it, they don't have terminology for it quite yet. And so one common example is actually, in English, we like to differentiate between snow, sleet, and freezing rain. That distinction is not as clear in Spanish just because we've never really had to worry about that in traditional Spanish-speaking countries. And so sometimes in some dialects, for example, the terms sleet and hail are actually interchangeable, and you have to be really, really careful with that because you don't want to tell people that it's hailing outside when it's just sleet kind of thing. And so, and most recently, the word snow squall, something very, very particular in the United States. We don't really have a word to describe that. And there's been debates within the bilingual community as to how we should best be able to translate this. So yeah, winter weather hazards are definitely something extremely challenging to communicate. And especially in a place like Texas, you're already very vulnerable to all of those hazards. And, it just introduces another layer, especially when the hard freeze happened just a couple years back here in Texas. Like, there was a lot of trouble translating a lot of that information, causing a lot of people to not take those proper protective actions. And so it's definitely a challenge. But anything that has to do with anything cold is something that we're looking forward to investing a lot more on in the future.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Anything else here or mine? I'll have one final fun question here. Did you know that NWA was going to be in Irving next year?
I saw that. Fun fact, NWA was actually in that same convention center I had my prom in a while back. So I'm just like, oh my gosh, like this is a throwback for me. Because we had our prom at the Irving Convention Center. And so I laughed so hard at it, and I look forward to going because I'm just like, oh, this is my hometown. This is easy. Irving has expanded so much ever since I was there, and it has a lot of beautiful attractions with the Toyota Music Factory and everything. And so, yeah, when I saw that, I laughed.
I was like, did you plan on coming back home?
Yeah, I'll be there. So if y'all are around at the National Weather Association, please feel free to stop by, say hello. And I mean, everyone's from the DFW area, so there's no sort of way to recommend anything there because y'all already know everything. But yeah, no, it's great. I went to Irving MacArthur High School, and so proud Cardinal.
I'm going to appreciate having to drive only 25 minutes to go to a conference instead of flying halfway across the country. Then again, I might regret that after going through morning rush hour every day. Who knows?
Yeah.
So, Joseph, thank you so much for this great presentation and your Q&A session. So, since this was all being recorded, it'll be on YouTube eventually. And we want to get you, Joseph, an Amazon gift card for being our speaker this month. I don't know when I'll be back in Norman. It could be Monday. It could be next month. Who knows? But probably the easiest would be to mail it to you. So we'll get with you afterwards for a mailing address with it. Just to get through chapter business real quick. Just save dues, $10. Student members are free. We do have events coming up in February. Both the science fairs are actually around the same time. The Fort Worth one is the 18th and 19th of February. The Dallas one is going to be the 17th. So that's, 3 days to get them all done. But we will figure it out amongst officers how to divvy up funds between both of them. Dave, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add.
I'll just mention that I have set up it may be a temporary website. I don't know. We'll figure out next year, but northtexasams.org. The AMS website is still not available, and we don't know when that's going to come around. So I just went ahead and set up a .org website. So northtexasams.org.
Yes, thank you, David. I know a few of us have went through it. It's great. It's nice we have a copy of everything. That was pretty much on the AMS website as they work through their issues with the local chapter. It is the week of the 14th in September. Somewhere around.
That's easy to find. Do we need as a chapter to start planning to have a presence?
Good question.
We have some time to plan.
Yeah. The main meeting will be the 16th through 18th of September, with student broadcasters happening the couple of days beforehand.
I renewed all my memberships, so I should be good.
Yeah, I think we're pretty well set here. Other than that, all right, the next meeting will be January 9th. We'll get you more details as they are ready. And other than that, I just want to say everyone have a great Christmas, happy holidays, happy New Year, and we'll see you on the flip side in 24. Thank you all.